I pulled into my driveway and found my wife standing at the gate with one canvas bag in the freezing rain. My own son had told her the house belonged to him now, and she needed to leave immediately. I did not shout. I did not break down. I simply picked up her bag, took her by the hand, and walked her right back inside. Then I made a single phone call that dismantled his entire existence. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Lamar. I am 70 years old, and I spent my entire life building a sanctuary that my only child tried to turn into a graveyard. It was past 3 in the morning when my shift at the municipal impound lot finally ended. My bones ached with the kind of deep, relentless cold that only decades of night shifts can embed in a man. The heater in my rusted 20-year-old pickup truck had given out 3 winters ago, and the freezing rain lashing against the windshield made the drive back to our quiet suburban neighborhood treacherous. As the headlights of my truck swept across the long driveway of my property, my heart seized in my chest. Brenda, my wife of 45 years, was standing outside our heavy wrought iron gate. The torrential downpour was soaking right through her thin wool coat. She was trembling violently, her arms wrapped around a single canvas duffel bag pressed against her chest. I threw the truck into park and rushed out into the icy rain. When I reached her, Brenda looked up at me with eyes full of a devastating sorrow. Her voice shook as she explained the incomprehensible. Our son, Javon, and his wife Nadine had ordered her out of her own home in the middle of the night. Javon had locked the gate behind her, declaring that he was now the sole legal owner of the estate. He told the woman who had carried him, fed him, and nurtured him that she ruined the modern aesthetic they needed to project for their upcoming luxury business launch. Standing in the freezing rain holding my shivering wife, I felt a familiar, dangerous heat rising in my chest. But anger is a weapon for the reckless. I took a deep breath, fighting the sudden strain on my recovering heart. I picked up her soaked duffel bag, gripped her cold hand firmly in mine, pulled my keys from my pocket, and unlocked the heavy iron gate to march us straight back into the house I had built. The heavy oak front door swung open, revealing a scene of sickening comfort. The grand foyer and living room were bathed in warm golden light from the crystal chandelier. Javon stood arrogantly by the stone fireplace, adjusting the cuffs of a custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than I made in 3 months at the lot. Across the room, his wife Nadine reclined on my expensive custom leather sofa. She held a crystal glass of imported Chardonnay, and a cruel, dismissive smirk crossed her face as she looked at Brenda dripping rainwater onto the hardwood floor. Javon stepped forward, physically blocking my path into the main living area. He did not look like a son greeting his father. He looked like a landlord evicting a tenant. Before I could utter a single word, Javon pulled a crisp folded document from his jacket pocket and shoved it into my chest. He announced with absolute, chilling confidence that he and Nadine required the full equity of the house to secure a massive commercial loan for their new venture. He claimed the property was legally his to leverage. I stared at the paper. It was a property deed transferring sole ownership of my estate entirely to him. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in unsteady, jagged ink, was my signature. Nadine took a slow sip of her wine, adding that they had important investors arriving soon and could not have us wandering the main halls looking like charity cases. The sheer audacity of their performance was paralyzing. They were attempting a hostile takeover of my life while standing on the floors I had polished with my own hands. Javon demanded we pack our remaining belongings and exit the premises before dawn, insisting the law was entirely on his side. Through the large bay windows, I could see the silhouettes of their 2 brand-new imported luxury sedans parked in the driveway. Those sleek machines sat in stark contrast to my battered, rusting pickup truck. A wave of bitter memories washed over me. I had worked grueling double shifts managing municipal transit yards and pulling night security at the impound lot for 40 continuous years. As a black man in this city, I knew the systemic hurdles my son would face, and I sacrificed every vacation, every new piece of clothing, every ounce of personal comfort to ensure Javan never knew the sharp sting of financial hardship. I paid his tuition at an elite Ivy League university entirely in cash, wiping out my visible personal accounts so he would graduate and enter the corporate world without a single cent of student loan debt. I wanted him to start his life from a position of absolute power, free from the generational burdens we had carried. I provided the pristine foundation he was now using to crush me. I raised a man who measured success entirely by superficial aesthetics and aggressive greed, completely devoid of the gratitude or honor his mother and I tried to instill in him. I held the forged deed closer to the light, adjusting my reading glasses. The jagged signature was undeniably mine, but it was the notary stamp beside it that caused the blood to freeze in my veins. The date stamped in bold black ink matched the exact week I had been fighting for my life in the cardiac intensive care unit. 6 months ago, I had undergone a severe heart bypass surgery. I remembered waking up in a haze of heavy narcotics, disoriented, and in excruciating pain. I remembered Javan rushing into my hospital room, acting frantic, carrying a thick stack of papers. He had told me they were emergency medical directives, required by the hospital administration to proceed with my post-operative care. He had physically guided my trembling hand across the pages, exploiting my medicated state to secure my signature. My own son had committed federal wire fraud and elder abuse to steal my legacy. The revelation was a heavy, suffocating weight, but my mind remained incredibly sharp. I knew a screaming match in the foyer would accomplish absolutely nothing against a notarized document and their supreme arrogance. Shouting would only give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. I folded the fraudulent deed and placed it in my coat pocket. I looked Javan dead in the eye, offering no reaction, no tears, no surrender. I simply took Brenda by the arm and led her away from the warmth of the fireplace, accepting a temporary retreat to the freezing, unfinished basement. I let them believe they had won. They thought they had discarded a foolish, helpless old man. They did not realize they had just declared war on a man who knew exactly how to dismantle them. The air in the basement storage room tasted of damp concrete and forgotten years. We navigated the narrow pathway between stacked boxes of holiday decorations and old winter coats. The single exposed bulb hanging from the rafter cast long, harsh shadows against the cinder block walls. A biting draft swept through the cracked weather stripping of the small ground-level window. The sudden chill seized my chest, sinking directly into the deep, tender tissue of my surgical scars. I gripped the wooden railing to steady my breathing, refusing to let Brenda see the sharp wince of pain crossing my face. She set her canvas duffel bag on the edge of the old folding cot I had stored down here during a renovation project 5 years ago. Above us, the heavy, arrogant thud of leather-soled shoes echoed through the floorboards. The noise did not belong to my son. Nadine had wasted absolutely no time. She had immediately moved her wealthy, arrogant parents, Gregory and Cynthia, into the master bedroom. I listened to the muffled scraping of heavy mahogany furniture being dragged across the hardwood floors I had installed by hand. They were claiming the space, expanding their territory, like conquering generals, while we were banished to the subterranean dark. Brenda sat on the edge of the thin mattress, wrapping her arms around her shoulders to ward off the biting cold. The sheer indignity of the situation hung heavily in the freezing air between us, a stark contrast to the warmth of the life we had built upstairs. The master suite, a room that contained 4 decades of our shared history, was now occupied by strangers who felt entitled to the fruits of my labor. I pulled a thick woolen blanket from a nearby storage trunk and draped it carefully over her shoulders. I kissed the crown of her head. I promised her silently that this exile was strictly temporary. I was not a man who surrendered his territory without a calculated response. I was simply observing the battlefield, mapping the exact trajectory of my retaliation, while the enemy celebrated their completely fabricated victory above our heads. Morning broke with the harsh clatter of footsteps directly above our heads. I made my way to the base of the wooden staircase, intending to secure a cup of coffee for Brenda. I stopped abruptly on the second step. A massive woven hamper overflowed with silk pajamas, imported linen shirts, and heavily soiled golfing trousers. It completely blocked the doorway. Tucked under the rim of the wicker basket was a piece of heavy cream cardstock. I pulled the note free and read the elegant looping handwriting. It was from Cynthia. She demanded that Brenda wash dry and precisely press every single garment before their scheduled dinner reservations that evening. She explicitly instructed the use of a specific expensive fabric softener and added a postscript insisting the laundry be folded and left outside their door, not handed to them directly. Gregory and Cynthia were treating my home like an all-inclusive luxury hotel, and they had unilaterally decided my wife was their assigned domestic staff. My jaw tightened so fiercely my teeth ached. Brenda walked up behind me, peering over my shoulder to read the handwritten command. A quiet, devastating humiliation washed over her features. For 45 years, she had maintained this house with pride, building a sanctuary for our family. Now intruders were forcing her into servitude within her own walls. I crumpled the heavy cardstock in my fist, the sound of the crushing paper exceptionally loud in the quiet stairwell. I turned to my wife and instructed her to leave the hamper exactly where it sat. I refused to let her lift a single garment belonging to the people actively facilitating our displacement. I took the crumpled note, shoved it deep into the pocket of my faded work trousers, and walked past the overflowing basket. The disrespect had escalated from a fraudulent property transfer to direct malicious degradation. They were testing the boundaries of their assumed power, pushing to see exactly how much humiliation we would swallow. I stepped over the wicker basket, my boots making no sound on the wood. I needed to look my son in the eye and see exactly how much of his soul he had traded for this lifestyle. I found Javon pacing the length of the grand living room, a sleek wireless earpiece tucked into his ear. He was speaking in hushed, frantic tones about a massive corporate merger and venture capital allocations. I stood silently by the archway until he noticed me. He held up a finger, commanding me to wait before abruptly ending the call. I held up the crumpled note from his mother-in-law. I demanded an explanation for the unbelievable disrespect directed at his own mother. Javon sighed, rolling his eyes as if I were a petulant child interrupting crucial adult business. He gestured dismissively at my worn, insulated transit yard jacket. He stated clearly that his parents simply needed to keep the peace. He claimed that Gregory and Cynthia represented high-level business connections vital to his impending merger. He told me that a man who spent 40 years tracking municipal train schedules could not possibly comprehend the mechanics of modern wealth or high-stakes corporate leverage. He instructed me to return to the basement and ensure Brenda washed the clothes to preserve the delicate aesthetic of his new lifestyle. I looked at the son I had sacrificed my entire physical prime to educate. He truly believed my blue-collar exterior equated to complete financial ignorance. He possessed absolutely no idea that my silence over the decades was the ultimate strategy of wealth accumulation. I nodded slowly, playing the role of the defeated laborer perfectly, and walked away. I stepped out the back door to collect the household garbage, maintaining my flawless cover as the obedient, broken old man relegated to menial chores. I hauled the heavy bins toward the curb in the freezing dampness. At the bottom of the main receptacle, shoved beneath discarded catering boxes and empty wine bottles, I spotted a heavy sealed black contractor bag. The plastic felt unusually dense. I carried the bag down the exterior bulkhead stairs directly into the basement. Under the harsh glare of the utility lamp, I sliced the thick plastic open with a pocket knife. A massive mound of shredded paper spilled across my workbench. These were not junk mail scraps. They were heavy, watermarked financial documents that had been hastily run through a cheap cross-cut shredder. I spent the entire agonizing night hunched over the wooden bench, my reading glasses perched on the bridge of my nose, painstakingly taping the jagged strips of paper together. As dawn broke, the reconstructed pages revealed a catastrophic reality. The documents were aggressive foreclosure notices and final demand letters from predatory private equity lenders. Javon's elite high society consulting firm was entirely bankrupt. He was millions of dollars in arrears, dodging calls from federal loan sharks. He was not securing a commercial loan to renovate my house for an aesthetic upgrade. He was orchestrating a rapid, highly illegal liquidation sale to save himself from federal prison. I stared at the taped pages, the full scope of his desperation becoming blindingly clear. The forged deed was just the first domino in his frantic scheme to survive his own gross incompetence. He had sold his soul, betrayed his mother, and risked my life entirely to cover his massive corporate failures. The hook was set, and I knew exactly how to pull the line. I sat under the harsh, flickering light of the single basement bulb, staring at the jagged tapestry of shredded paper I had spent hours reassembling. My back ached from hunching over the improvised wooden workbench, but the sheer gravity of what lay before me eliminated any physical exhaustion. The reconstructed documents were not routine corporate filings or standard business ledgers. They were aggressive final demand notices and impending foreclosure threats from a syndicate of ruthless private equity lenders notorious for dismantling companies and liquidating assets. I traced my calloused finger over the bold red ink detailing the astronomical figures. Javon's elite high society consulting firm, the venture he had endlessly boasted about at family dinners, was entirely bankrupt. He was millions of dollars in arrears. The polished veneer of success he projected upstairs was a desperate, hollow fabrication. He was actively dodging calls from aggressive corporate liquidators who threatened severe legal action, including the immediate seizure of all personal and business assets. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. Javon was not attempting to secure a commercial loan to renovate my house for some grand aesthetic upgrade. He was orchestrating a rapid, highly illegal liquidation sale of my estate. He needed an immediate, massive influx of untraceable cash to satisfy these predatory lenders and save himself from a lengthy sentence in federal prison. My son had not simply become greedy. He had become dangerously desperate. He was willing to render his own parents homeless to cover his gross negligence and criminal mismanagement. The forged property deed was simply the most accessible lifeline he could grab to keep his sinking ship afloat for a few more weeks. I felt a cold detachment replace the lingering sorrow in my chest. He was treating our family home as collateral for his impending ruin. I gathered the reconstructed pages, sliding them carefully into a protective plastic sleeve I found in my tool chest. I needed more evidence to understand the full scope of his financial collapse. I reached back into the black garbage bag, pulling out the remaining shredded strips to continue my silent investigation. As I pieced together the second batch of documents, a completely different financial trail began to emerge. This was a secondary hidden ledger separate from Javon's failing firm. I squinted through my reading glasses, aligning the torn columns of names and routing numbers. The transfers were frequent, systematic, and incredibly large. Nadine was secretly funneling Javon's rapidly dwindling business credit lines directly into an offshore holding account. I tracked the ultimate destination of those funds across multiple shell accounts. They were being routed directly to Gregory and Cynthia. Nadine's parents, the arrogant couple currently sleeping in my master bedroom and demanding Brenda wash their clothes, were not wealthy investors. They were entirely broke. The ledger detailed overdue notices for their luxury vehicle leases and imminent suspension warnings from their prestigious exclusive country club. They were drowning in their own massive debts, maintaining their upper-class illusion by siphoning the last remaining drops of capital from my son's collapsing business. Javon was orchestrating a hostile takeover of my property to save himself, completely unaware that his own wife was actively bleeding his remaining resources dry from the inside. He was being played with masterful precision by the very woman he had chosen over his own family. Nadine and her parents were parasitic entities attaching themselves to Javon's desperate ambition to fund their superficial lifestyle. They tolerated him only because he provided access to lines of credit and now access to my real estate. The sheer audacity of their multi-layered deception was astounding. Javan believed he was the brilliant architect of a grand corporate strategy, outsmarting his aging blue-collar parents. In reality, he was the primary victim of his wife's calculated financial drain. He was betraying the only people who had ever truly protected him, all to impress a family that viewed him strictly as an expendable asset. I stacked this secondary ledger next to the private equity demands. The enemy camp was divided by massive hidden betrayals. I knew that exposing these secrets at the precise moment would shatter their alliance entirely. I read through the complex financial jargon, derivative structures, and equity loan covenants effortlessly. My hands were calloused from decades of manual labor, but my mind had never stopped working. Javan always assumed my municipal job meant I lacked intellectual sophistication. He believed my worn boots and faded jackets were signs of a simple, uneducated existence. He never realized that managing the logistics of a massive city transit yard required an immaculate understanding of resource allocation, budget forecasting, and complex municipal contracts. While he was paying exorbitant fees to attend networking seminars, I was spending my nights analyzing corporate market trends and studying the intricate mechanics of real estate debt. I had cultivated a highly analytical mind, hiding my financial literacy behind a quiet, unassuming demeanor. I intentionally presented myself as a simple laborer to ensure Javan learned the value of hard work without relying on my resources. I wanted him to build his own character to earn his success. I shielded him from my true capabilities to protect his drive. Now that same underestimation was his fatal flaw. He believed he was manipulating a man who could not comprehend basic property law. He had no idea he was dealing with someone who understood the devastating legal implications of his actions far better than he did. My blue-collar life was the perfect camouflage for the war I was about to wage. I quietly ascended the basement stairs, just as the morning sun began to filter through the windows. The house was still silent. I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch to retrieve the Daily Mail before Nadine or Javan could intercept it. Sifting through the glossy catalogs and utility bills, my eyes locked onto a thick, certified envelope from the county probate court, addressed directly to Javan. I carried the envelope back down to the basement, using a thin blade to carefully open the seal without tearing the paper. I unfolded the official documents, and my blood ran ice cold. Javan was fully aware that executing a rapid liquidation sale of an occupied property required bypassing the state's mandatory 90-day eviction laws. He could not wait 3 months for Brenda and me to vacate. He needed the money immediately. To circumvent the law, he had petitioned the state court to declare both Brenda and me mentally incompetent. The filing claimed we were suffering from advanced aggressive dementia and were a severe danger to ourselves. The petition requested immediate emergency medical guardianship be granted to Javan. He was not just stealing my home. He was actively attempting to strip away my fundamental human rights and have me permanently institutionalized against my will. This document was the legal mechanism he needed to force us into a state facility and sell the house by the end of the week. My son was crossing the threshold from financial fraud into absolute, irredeemable malice. He had lit the fuse, but he had no idea I was the one controlling the powder keg. I needed to strike back, but my movements required absolute precision and total secrecy. Any indication that I understood the depth of Javan's financial ruin or his legal maneuvers would trigger him to act prematurely. Before the sun even breached the horizon, I quietly rose from the stiff basement cot. I dressed in my faded municipal transit security uniform, pulling the heavy worn fabric over my shoulders, just as I had done for 40 years. I laced up my scuffed steel-toed boots, ensuring every detail of the defeated blue-collar laborer remained perfectly intact. I slipped out the bulkhead doors, feeling the bitter morning frost bite at my cheeks, and climbed into my rusted pickup truck. The engine sputtered and roared to life, a familiar grating sound that Javan undoubtedly heard from his stolen master suite. I wanted him to hear it. I wanted him to roll over in his expensive imported sheets and smile, entirely convinced that his broken old father was heading off to another menial 12-hour shift at the city impound lot. I put the truck in gear and pulled out of the driveway, leaving my occupied home behind. But I did not drive toward the industrial district. Instead, I merged onto the highway and headed straight for the heart of the downtown financial sector. The early morning traffic was sparse, allowing my mind to process the sheer gravity of my son's betrayal. He viewed my life as disposable collateral. He had petitioned a court to strip away my basic human rights, attempting to erase my mind simply to satisfy his catastrophic debts. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, channeling the burning betrayal into a cold, calculated focus. I pulled into a reserved underground parking garage beneath a towering 70-story glass skyscraper. The sleek, modern structure dominated the city skyline, a monument to corporate power and high-stakes leverage. I parked my battered truck between two pristine luxury sedans, killed the engine, and grabbed the protective plastic sleeve containing the reconstructed, shredded documents. I bypassed the bustling main lobby entirely. I walked past the marble security desk and the young attendants in their sharp suits, moving with a purposeful stride toward a secluded alcove in the rear of the atrium. I retrieved a heavy brass executive key from my pocket, slipped it into the hidden panel of a private biometric elevator, and turned the cylinder. The polished steel doors slid open silently. The elevator ascended rapidly, leaving the ground floor far below, carrying me directly to the penthouse suite. The doors parted to reveal the immaculate, expansive offices of Gaines and Associates. The firm was infamous throughout the state. They were ruthless corporate litigators, men who dismantled rival companies with surgical precision. I walked past the shocked administrative assistants, my faded uniform, a stark contrast to the imported modern art and sleek glass partitions lining the corridor. I did not knock when I reached the massive double doors at the end of the hall. I pushed them open and stepped into the office of attorney Marcus Gaines. Gaines was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who charged astronomical fees to protect the city's most formidable financial entities. He did not flinch at my faded jacket or my scuffed boots. He knew exactly who I was and the sheer magnitude of the capital I controlled. He looked up from his computer monitor, his sharp eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second, before a deep look of absolute respect settled over his features. I walked straight to his massive mahogany desk. I did not offer a greeting. I pulled the plastic sleeve from my jacket and dropped the painstakingly taped together financial documents directly onto the polished wood. I told him my son had forged a property deed, bankrupted his own consulting firm, and filed a fraudulent medical petition to have my wife and me permanently institutionalized. I demanded immediate catastrophic retaliation. I instructed him to tear into the financial architecture of Javon's life and find every hidden weakness, every illegal transfer, and every desperate maneuver. Attorney Gaines did not question my appearance or my authority. He simply nodded, picking up the reconstructed documents with practiced care. Javon believed my entire world consisted of train schedules and impound logs. He never knew that my municipal job was merely a reliable front, a source of stable health insurance, and a perfect camouflage. 30 years ago, I began quietly purchasing dilapidated commercial real estate across the city using my overtime savings. I bought abandoned storefronts, renovated them with my own hands, and flipped them into thriving strip malls and corporate office parks. I channeled every massive profit into a heavily guarded, impenetrable corporate entity known as Caldwell Equity. I was the sole proprietor, the silent executive, and the absolute owner of a multi-million-dollar empire. My wealth was vast, secured behind layers of corporate trusts and ironclad non-disclosure agreements. I lived in a modest home and drove a rusted truck because I wanted Javon to learn the value of earning his own success. I shielded him from the sheer magnitude of my resources to protect his ambition, hoping he would build his own legacy through hard work and determination. Instead, he developed an insatiable appetite for superficial status, mistaking my quiet humility for complete financial ignorance. He believed he was outsmarting a foolish old man who could not comprehend the modern world. He had no idea he had just initiated a hostile takeover against the chief executive officer of Caldwell Equity. I sat in the leather chair opposite the desk, my posture rigid as Attorney Gaines immediately mobilized his entire legal team. I ordered a brutal, comprehensive forensic audit on both Javon and Nadine. I wanted every bank account, every shell company, and every hidden transaction brought to the surface and scrutinized. I sat in silence for a grueling hour, while Gaines and his associates tore through the digital infrastructure of my son's life. The quiet hum of the penthouse office was broken only by the frantic typing of legal assistants in the adjacent room. Finally, Attorney Gaines walked back into his private office, his expression dangerously grim. He closed the heavy mahogany doors and locked them, ensuring absolute privacy. He informed me that the forensic audit had uncovered something far more urgent than the private equity debt. Javon had not just filed the petition for emergency medical guardianship. He had heavily expedited it, using his remaining stolen funds to bribe a corrupt magistrate. Gaines turned his monitor to face me, displaying a freshly intercepted digital manifest. Javon had hired a private, highly aggressive psychiatric transport company. The manifest detailed a scheduled extraction for tomorrow night. Under the cover of a lavish dinner party Javon was hosting for prospective investors, a specialized medical team was ordered to arrive at my home. Their explicit instructions were to forcibly remove Brenda and me from the basement, apply chemical restraints if necessary, and transport us directly to a secure lockdown facility outside the city limits. The extraction was classified as a high-risk dementia removal. Javon was planning to have us physically dragged from our home in front of his wealthy guests to cement his narrative of our mental decline. I drove back to the house with the rising sun casting long, pale shadows across the frost-covered lawns. Time was no longer a luxury I possessed. Javon had set a countdown ticking the moment he finalized that extraction manifest. I parked my rusted pickup truck halfway down the block to avoid alerting anyone inside the house. I walked quietly across the damp grass and slipped down into the exterior basement bulkhead. Brenda was sitting exactly where I had left her on the folding cot. She was wrapped in the heavy wool blanket with a cup of cold tea resting beside her. I knelt in front of her and explained the gravity of the situation. I told her Javon had escalated his fraudulent eviction into a medical kidnapping. I watched the initial shock wash over her face before it solidified into a profound, heartbreaking realization of our son's sheer malice. There was no time for tears or hesitation. We needed to secure our legal standing immediately. Upstairs, the heavy thud of footsteps signaled that Nadine and her parents were awake, likely preparing to commandeer the kitchen for their lavish breakfast. Javon would be occupied with his morning conference calls, barking orders into his headset while pacing the hardwood floors. Their arrogance was our greatest advantage. They believed we were too thoroughly defeated to mount any form of resistance. I grabbed Brenda's heavy coat and draped it over her shoulders. I took her hand and guided her up the concrete steps of the bulkhead. We moved with deliberate silence, slipping through the damp morning air and hurrying down the street toward my parked truck. The cold wind bit at our faces, but the urgency of survival pushed us forward. We were fugitives escaping our own property, fighting a war against the boy we had brought into this world. I unlocked the passenger door and helped her inside. I put the truck in gear and navigated through the waking city toward the address Attorney Gaines had provided. We arrived at a sleek, heavily secured medical building situated in the affluent northern suburbs. This was a private, board-certified psychiatric clinic renowned for its impenetrable clinical assessments. Attorney Gaines had already authorized the astronomical retainer required to bypass the standard waiting list. The medical staff expected us. They ushered Brenda and me into separate, sterile examination rooms, devoid of any comfort or distraction. What followed was the most grueling intellectual gauntlet of my life. For 4 continuous hours, a panel of specialized neurologists and senior psychiatrists subjected us to rigorous cognitive stress tests. They demanded rapid solutions to complex mathematical equations. They required us to memorize and recite intricate sequences of numbers and randomly generated words. They administered extensive psychological evaluations designed to detect the slightest hint of cognitive decline or memory fragmentation. They probed our spatial reasoning, our logical deduction capabilities, and our emotional stability under extreme duress. The bright fluorescent lights overhead burned into my retinas, but I answered every single prompt with absolute unflinching precision. I drew upon the decades of intense analytical focus I had honed while building my real estate empire in secret. I calculated percentages and verified historical timelines with immediate accuracy. Brenda performed with equal brilliance, drawing on her years of meticulous household management and sharp intellectual curiosity. We were proving our sanity to strangers to prevent our own son from erasing our identities. The clinical detachment of the doctors was exhausting, but I welcomed their thoroughness. I needed their assessment to be completely unassailable. Every difficult question answered correctly was another lock snapping shut against Javon's fraudulent narrative. We were building an impenetrable fortress of medical facts. We reunited in the quiet, carpeted waiting area while the medical panel compiled their final reports. Brenda sat close to me, her hands resting in her lap. She looked at me with a mixture of profound exhaustion and deep curiosity. She asked the question that had clearly been weighing heavily on her mind since I revealed the truth about our financial standing. She asked why I had never told Javon about Caldwell Equity. She asked why I had allowed our son to believe we were simple laborers while I commanded a corporate fortune. I kept my voice low and steady. I explained that immense wealth is a corrosive force for an unformed mind. I wanted Javon to build his own character through the grueling friction of hard work and honest struggle. Giving him access to millions of dollars before he understood the discipline required to earn a single paycheck would have destroyed his ambition. I wanted him to possess a foundation of integrity, to respect the labor of others because he had experienced it himself. I shielded him from the money to protect his soul. Brenda looked down at her hands, a bitter sorrow tightening her features. She noted that Javon had managed to completely destroy his own character, regardless of my precautions. He had chosen the path of aggressive greed, mistaking our quiet humility for weakness. My sacrifice had not saved him. It had only delayed the manifestation of his true nature. The heavy oak door of the consultation room swung open. The chief psychiatrist approached us with a pair of thick, leather-bound folders. He announced that our results were exceptionally high. He handed us the official notarized certificates of perfect mental health. These documents were signed by 3 independent board-certified medical professionals. The language within the reports was absolute and unequivocal. The evaluations explicitly stated that both Brenda and I possessed flawless cognitive function, robust memory recall, and pristine psychological stability. We were completely immune to any legal or medical claim of dementia. Javon's petition for emergency guardianship was now entirely useless, a fraudulent weapon that would backfire the moment he attempted to wield it. I secured the folders inside my jacket, feeling the weight of the impenetrable armor we had just forged. I thanked the medical staff and escorted Brenda back to the truck. We drove back to our neighborhood just as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the tree line. The street in front of my estate was lined with commercial vans. Javon's high-stakes dinner party was taking shape. Delivery drivers were unloading crates of expensive wine and trays of imported delicacies. I parked out of sight and led Brenda through the side gate, utilizing the heavy shadows of the manicured hedges. We slipped down the concrete stairs and re-entered the damp basement through the bulkhead doors. We were back inside the belly of the beast, perfectly positioned and heavily armed. Above us, the clinking of crystal glasses and the booming, arrogant laughter of my son signaled the beginning of his grand performance. The trap was set, and the prey was eagerly inviting his guests to witness his own destruction. The heavy oak floorboards above our heads groaned under the weight of a dozen arriving caterers. The rich, savory aroma of roasted meats and expensive wine reductions drifted down the narrow basement staircase, a sharp contrast to the damp metallic scent of the concrete room where Brenda and I sat. We listened to the frenetic symphony of clinking crystal and the hurried footsteps of hired staff preparing the grand dining room. Javon was orchestrating his masterpiece. He was hosting a lavish dinner party designed to seduce a syndicate of wealthy real estate investors. These were the men he desperately needed to purchase the estate, the men whose capital would briefly stave off his impending federal indictment. The basement door swung open at the top of the stairs, framing Javan against the warm golden light of the foyer. He descended the wooden steps with a rigid, agitated posture. He wore a brand-new midnight blue tuxedo, tailored to project an aura of effortless success. However, a thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead, betraying the sheer panic vibrating beneath his expensive facade. He glared at us with a mixture of contempt and terror. He explicitly ordered us to remain entirely silent and completely out of sight for the remainder of the evening. He stated that the presence of two frail, confused elders would absolutely ruin the sophisticated atmosphere he required to close his lucrative deal. He did not wait for my response. He turned on his heel, marched back up the stairs, and slammed the heavy wooden door shut. A second later, the harsh, definitive click of the exterior steel deadbolt echoed down the stairwell. My own son had physically locked us in the basement, like unwanted animals, to ensure we did not interfere with the liquidation of our own home. Brenda let out a soft, shuddering breath, wrapping the woolen blanket tighter around her shoulders. She looked at the locked door, the final indignity in a long sequence of betrayals. I did not raise my voice. I did not pound my fists against the wood or shout demands for our release. Panic is the refuge of the unprepared. I simply walked over to the battered steel toolbox resting on my old wooden workbench. I flipped open the rusted latches and retrieved a small leather pouch wrapped in a rubber band. During my 40 years managing the municipal impound lot, I had legally bypassed thousands of seized locks and chained gates. I possessed an intimate mechanical understanding of tumblers and tension. I climbed the wooden stairs with absolute silent precision. I slid a thin steel tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway and inserted a half-diamond pick above it. I applied gentle, even pressure, feeling the small brass pins inside the mechanism bind and set one by one. The entire process required less than 30 seconds. The heavy deadbolt rotated with a soft, yielding click. I pushed the door open just a fraction of an inch, allowing myself to step seamlessly into the deep shadows of the rear hallway. I left the door slightly ajar, so I could retreat instantly if necessary. From my concealed vantage point, I possessed a clear line of sight into the grand dining room. The table was laden with silver platters and imported wine. Javan sat at the head of the table holding court before a group of 5 sharp-eyed investors. I stood perfectly still in the darkness, listening to my son weave a tapestry of absolute fabricated brilliance. He boasted loudly about the massive liquidity of his consulting firm, dropping corporate buzzwords and projecting an image of invincible generational wealth. The extreme contrast between Javan's desperate debt-fueled ostentation and my quiet, genuine power became sharply apparent in that shadowy hallway. I listened to him pitch my estate as a minor asset in his vast, ever-expanding portfolio. He was selling them an illusion constructed entirely out of leveraged credit and forged signatures. He desperately needed their capital to pacify the private equity lenders breathing down his neck. True wealth does not scream for attention over plates of roasted quail. True wealth is silent. It does not require validation or applause. I had built Caldwell Equity from the ground up, turning dilapidated commercial structures into a massive, impenetrable corporate empire. My foundation was forged in decades of sweat calluses and meticulous market analysis. I knew the exact value of every property I owned, including the towering glass skyscraper where Javan currently rented his failing office space. He believed his tailored tuxedo and his leased imported cars made him a king. He had completely insulated himself from the reality of labor, convincing himself that appearance equated to actual equity. He was a hollow shell of a businessman, standing on the edge of a catastrophic precipice, entirely unaware that the man he had locked in the basement owned the very ground he was preparing to jump from. As the dinner progressed, The conversation in the dining room shifted toward the logistics of the property transfer. I watched Nadine suddenly stand up from the table. She offered the guests a charming, perfectly practiced smile, excusing herself to use the restroom. Her eyes, however, lacked any genuine warmth. They were hard, calculating, and fixed on a specific objective. I melted deeper into the shadows of the corridor as she walked briskly past my position, completely unaware of my presence. She did not head toward the guest powder room near the foyer. Instead, she moved directly to the expansive, marble-lined bathroom, adjacent to the main hallway, a space situated directly above the dining room's antique Persian rugs. I tracked her movements with cold detachment. Nadine stepped inside and deliberately plugged the deep porcelain sink with a washcloth. She reached out and turned the heavy brass faucets onto their maximum capacity. She did not stop there. She forcefully kicked the decorative plumbing pipes beneath the basin, fracturing a pressurized seal. Water immediately began to erupt across the polished marble floor. It cascaded over the threshold, flooding rapidly into the main hallway and soaking right through the priceless textiles I had purchased a decade ago. Nadine waited exactly 30 seconds, allowing the destruction to become visually catastrophic. Then she opened her mouth and unleashed a piercing, blood-curdling scream of pure, fabricated terror. She shouted at the top of her lungs, projecting her voice so it would echo directly into the dining room. She screamed that Brenda had escaped. She wailed that my wife's mind was completely gone, that she was destroying the house in a violent, confused rage. The investors leaped from their chairs, alarmed by the sudden chaos. Javon rushed into the hallway, playing his role in their orchestrated theater. Nadine clutched her face, sobbing dramatically. She announced to the horrified guests that they could no longer manage my wife's severe dementia. She declared with a voice full of fake sorrow that she had no choice but to call the emergency psychiatric transport team she had prudently kept on standby. The staged crisis was executed flawlessly. The trap was finally sprung, and the extraction team was on its way. The shrill, piercing echo of Nadine's fabricated scream was still vibrating against the crystal chandeliers when the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots sounded on the front porch. She had timed it with absolute sociopathic perfection. Less than 3 minutes after her theatrical display over the flooded marble floor, a sharp, authoritative pounding rattled the heavy oak of the front door. The investors, already on edge from the sudden influx of water seeping into the hallway, stared in stunned silence. Javon, moving with the practiced urgency of a man executing a rehearsed script, rushed past the caterers and swung the door wide open. 2 massive men in stark white clinical uniforms stood on the threshold. They were not standard paramedics. They possessed the broad shoulders and hardened expressions of tactical orderlies, the kind of men employed specifically to subdue and transport uncooperative, aggressive patients. One of them carried a thick clipboard bearing the crest of a private, high-security psychiatric facility. The other held a heavy canvas medical bag, the unmistakable metallic clinking of leather restraints echoing faintly from within. They stepped into the foyer without waiting for an invitation, their presence instantly transforming the elegant dinner party into a clinical extraction site. The lead orderly asked for Javon by name, his voice booming over the quiet murmurs of the horrified real estate investors. He demanded immediate confirmation of the emergency medical guardianship petition. The trap Javon had meticulously built over the past several weeks was finally snapping shut. He was using the sheer shock and public humiliation of the flooded bathroom to validate the arrival of this extraction team. He wanted his wealthy guests to witness the chaotic burden he was supposedly bearing, framing his hostile takeover of my estate as an act of desperate mercy. The men in white stood like executioners, completely unaware that the legal documents resting on their clipboard were entirely fraudulent. They were simply the blunt instruments my son had hired to physically erase his parents from his life. Javon immediately shifted his posture, physically deflating, to project the image of a profoundly burdened and heartbroken son. He rubbed his temples, offering the men in white a look of exhausted defeat that was entirely rehearsed. He turned toward the stunned real estate investors, offering a dramatic, sweeping apology for the sudden disruption. He claimed, his voice cracking with artificial emotion, that his mother's condition had deteriorated far more rapidly than any doctor had anticipated. He painted a tragic, fraudulent picture of aggressive dementia, describing violent outbursts and complete cognitive collapse. He pointed to the water actively ruining the expensive Persian rugs as irrefutable proof of her destructive incapacity. The lead orderly handed Javon a thick stack of intake forms and a black pen. Javon took the pen with trembling hands, playing the role of the reluctant savior to absolute perfection. He sighed deeply, shaking his head in fake sorrow as he began to sign his name across the bottom of the committal authorizations. Standing near the archway of the formal living room, Gregory and Cynthia observed the entire performance with smug, unvarnished satisfaction. Nadine's parents did not even attempt to hide their relief. They sipped from their crystal wine glasses, exchanging knowing, triumphant glances. With Brenda and me permanently locked inside a secure psychiatric ward, their living arrangement in my home would be cemented. They were watching their parasitic future being secured with every stroke of Javon's pen. They believed they had won the war without lifting a single finger, completely reliant on their son-in-law's willingness to commit a grotesque familial betrayal. Javon handed the signed paperwork back to the orderly completing the transaction. He had officially signed away my freedom. He gave the tactical team a solemn nod, granting them permission to descend into the basement and forcibly extract the violent patients he had just fabricated. He was sacrificing his own flesh and blood to impress a room full of strangers who viewed him only as a temporary financial vehicle. I remained perfectly motionless in the heavy shadows of the rear corridor, watching my son complete his ultimate act of treason. A sudden sharp memory pierced through my calculated detachment. I remembered standing in a sterile hospital room 35 years ago, holding Javon when he was only hours old. I remembered looking down at his fragile, sleeping face and making a silent, unbreakable vow to protect him from the harshness of the world. I had worked grueling double shifts in the freezing rain at the transit yard, breaking my back to ensure he never knew the stinging bite of poverty. I had built a secret empire, denying myself every luxury solely to guarantee his future would be secure. I had spent my entire adult life constructing a fortress to shield my son from ruin. Now, standing in the dark hallway of the home I had built with my own hands, the devastating irony threatened to suffocate me. The boy I had sworn to protect had become the very monster I needed to protect myself against. My sacrifices had not fostered gratitude. They had bred a ruthless, entitled arrogance. He was weaponizing the life I gave him to destroy mine. The quiet sorrow that had been aching in my chest finally evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. The time for paternal leniency was over. The two massive orderlies secured the signed documents on their clipboard and turned their attention toward the rear of the house. Javon pointed a trembling finger toward the basement door, instructing the men to exercise extreme caution, warning them that the patients were highly aggressive and severely disoriented. The men nodded, unsnapping the heavy leather restraints from their canvas bags. They moved with heavy, deliberate steps down the hallway, closing the distance to the basement door where they expected to find a broken, rambling old man. They did not make it past the dining room archway. I stepped directly out of the dense shadows and into the warm, golden illumination of the crystal chandeliers. I was not wearing my scuffed, steel-toed boots. I was not wearing the faded, insulated transit yard jacket that Javon despised. I was wearing a custom-tailored, immaculate charcoal executive suit cut from imported wool, paired with a pristine white collar and a heavy silk tie. The profound, undeniable authority of my appearance hit the room like a physical shockwave. The transformation was absolute and instantaneous. I did not look like a senile, defeated laborer waiting to be dragged into an institution. I looked exactly like the formidable multi-million-dollar corporate executive I truly was. The heavy footsteps of the tactical orderlies ground to a sudden, confused halt. The wealthy real estate investors sitting at the dining table froze, their wine glasses hovering in the air. Javon's mouth fell open, his rehearsed expression of sorrow instantly shattering into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He stared at the immaculate tailoring of my suit, his brain completely failing to process the reality standing before him. I adjusted my silk tie, looking my son directly in the eye, and asked him if there was a problem with the plumbing. The silence in the grand dining room was absolute, broken only by the steady drip of water seeping from the hallway into the expensive Persian rug. The 5 wealthy real estate investors shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed mahogany chairs. They exchanged sharp, bewildered whispers, their eyes darting between my immaculate charcoal suit and my son's panicked face. This was not the violently unhinged, dementia-riddled old man they had just been promised. This was a man who commanded the room simply by standing in it. Javan remained entirely frozen. His hand trembled violently, the expensive fountain pen hovering millimeters above the final medical release document on the orderly's clipboard. He looked as though the air had been physically stolen from his lungs. The manufactured crisis he had so carefully orchestrated was evaporating under the harsh glare of the crystal chandeliers. Gregory and Cynthia, who only moments ago were radiating smug satisfaction, now looked completely terrified, pressing themselves against the far wall of the formal living room, as if trying to merge with the silk wallpaper. Nadine stood near the flooded bathroom doorway, her face pale, her theatrical tears drying instantly on her cheeks. The lead tactical orderly looked at Javan, then looked at me, his heavy brow furrowing in deep confusion. His professional training dictated securing a hostile patient, but the man standing before him was projecting the quiet, dangerous authority of a corporate chief executive. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The leather soles of my shoes made a sharp, authoritative sound against the dry section of the hardwood floor. I did not break eye contact with my son. I let the silence stretch, letting the sheer gravity of his monumental failure press down on his shoulders. He was desperately trying to calculate a way out of the trap he had built for me, but his mind was paralyzed by the sudden destruction of his entire narrative. He had sold an illusion of power, and reality had just walked through the front door. I shifted my gaze from my trembling son to the lead medical orderly. I reached inside the breast pocket of my suit jacket and retrieved the thick, leather-bound folder I had secured just hours earlier. I extended my hand, offering the heavy document with absolute calm. I advised the man to thoroughly review the paperwork before he made a catastrophic career error. The orderly cautiously accepted the folder, flipping it open under the bright lights of the foyer. His eyes scanned the crisp, watermarked pages. He saw the official seals of the city's most prestigious private psychiatric clinic. He read the explicit, unequivocal conclusions signed by 3 independent, board-certified neurologists. The documents verified my flawless cognitive function, my pristine psychological stability, and my absolute legal competence. The orderly's face hardened. He recognized the signatures. He knew the immense legal weight those specific medical professionals commanded in the state. He looked up at Javan, his expression morphing from clinical detachment to furious realization. He understood immediately that he had been hired under entirely fraudulent pretenses. This was not a medical extraction. This was an attempted kidnapping, and Javan had tried to make him an accessory to a severe federal crime. The orderly shoved the blank committal forms back into Javan's chest with disgusted force. He signaled his partner with a sharp jerk of his head. He announced loudly to the entire room that his medical transport company wanted absolutely no part of this massive liability. He stated that the psychiatric clearance I provided was ironclad and superseded any emergency petition Javan had filed with the magistrate. Javan sputtered, reaching out to grab the man's sleeve, begging him to stay and complete the job. The orderly easily shoved my son's hand away, warning him that if he contacted their facility again, they would immediately notify the authorities. The 2 massive men turned on their heels, marching out the front door and pulling it firmly shut behind them. The sound of their departing van rolling down the driveway signaled the total collapse of my son's medical ambush. I turned my attention back to Javan. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving beneath his tailored midnight blue tuxedo. I walked slowly toward the head of the dining table, forcing the bewildered investors to pull their chairs back to give me space. I stopped inches from my son. I lowered my voice, ensuring my words cut through the remaining tension in the room with absolute clarity. I reminded him of a humid summer evening 20 years ago. I had spent 12 hours laying concrete for a new municipal transit depot, coming home with bleeding hands and an aching spine. I had found him complaining about a difficult high school assignment, looking for a shortcut, wanting to cheat his way to a passing grade. I had sat him down and told him that a man who builds his kingdom on another man's foundation will always be crushed when the earth inevitably moves. I had tried to teach him that borrowed power is entirely fragile, that true strength only comes from the integrity of your own labor. Javon turned a sickly shade of gray, the blood draining from his face as the memory struck him. He had spent his entire adult life ignoring that lesson. He had built his polished high society facade entirely on lies, aggressive debt, and the parasitic draining of my resources. The earth was finally moving beneath his feet, and the structural integrity of his fraudulent life was shattering. Blind, desperate panic seized Javon. The sophisticated corporate consultant completely vanished, replaced by a cornered, terrified animal. He scrambled wildly toward the center of the dining table, knocking over a crystal wine decanter that shattered violently against the floor. He ignored the spreading crimson stain, snatching up the heavy manila folder containing the forged property deed. He turned toward the horrified real estate investors, waving the fraudulent document in the air like a desperate weapon. He shouted hoarsely that the house belonged to him. He screamed that he was the sole legal owner of the estate, that the sale was still moving forward, and that they needed to execute the contracts and write the checks immediately. He pointed a shaking finger at me, demanding that I leave his premises right now, or he would call the police and have me arrested for criminal trespassing. He was clinging to the very last scrap of his fabricated reality, trying to force the wealthy investors to validate his lies and provide him with the capital he needed to survive. The investors simply stared at him in profound disgust, recognizing the unmistakable stench of a doomed bankrupt fraud. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue against his desperate, screaming claims. I simply reached into my trouser pocket and pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen, navigated to a specific heavily encrypted corporate application, and tapped the glowing execution icon once. I placed the phone back into my pocket. I looked at Javon's wild, bloodshot eyes, and then I simply nodded my head toward the massive bay window facing the front street. The heavy mahogany front doors swung inward with a violent, resounding crash that shattered the remaining tension in the room. The polished brass hinges groaned under the sheer force of the sudden entrance. Attorney Marcus Gaines stepped over the threshold, moving with the predatory grace of a man who dismantles lives for a living. He was flanked instantly by two massive uniformed police officers, their hands resting casually on their duty belts. The visual impact of law enforcement storming into a lavish dinner party acted like a physical blow to the room. The wealthy real estate investors, already backing away from Javon's frantic screaming display, froze entirely. The catering staff vanished into the corners, dropping their silver trays in a clatter of fine china. A dead, suffocating silence descended over the grand dining room. The orchestrated illusion of Javon's high society gathering collapsed into a stark crime scene. Javon stood paralyzed at the head of the table. His arm remained suspended in the air, still clutching the forged property deed, but his voice had completely evaporated. He stared at the officers with wide, bloodshot eyes, his breath hitching painfully in his chest. Nadine backed slowly toward the hallway archway, instinctively placing distance between herself and her husband. Gregory and Cynthia pressed themselves flat against the living room wall, their smug satisfaction replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. I remained anchored in my position beneath the crystal chandelier, smoothing the lapels of my custom-tailored charcoal suit. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of explanation to the horrified guests. I simply watched the inevitable consequence of my son's arrogance march directly across the flooded Persian rugs. The trap had not just snapped shut. It had locked completely, sealing Javan inside a cage of his own desperate construction. Attorney Gaines surveyed the silent, terrified room with absolute clinical detachment. He adjusted his pristine cuffs, his eyes sweeping over the spilled wine and the ruined flooring before locking onto my son. He moved forward, his leather shoes making sharp, deliberate strikes against the hardwood. Attorney Gaines did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout to command absolute authority. He walked directly to the head of the long dining table and stopped inches from Javan's trembling frame. The investors scattered, clearing a wide path for the litigator and the two armed officers. Gaines reached inside his immaculate leather briefcase and withdrew a single thick legal folder sealed with a red corporate insignia. He extended his arm and pressed the heavy file flat against Javan's chest, forcing my son to take it or let it drop to the floor. Javan grabbed the cardboard mechanically, his knuckles white. Gaines spoke with a low, conversational tone that carried a lethal edge. He informed my son that the document he was holding was not a simple eviction notice. It was a formal declaration of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and severe criminal elder abuse. Javan tried to speak, attempting to formulate a coherent defense, but only a dry rasp escaped his throat. Gaines methodically outlined the trap Javan had stepped into. He explained that forging a property deed to satisfy predatory private equity lenders constituted a massive federal offense. He then gestured toward the ruined hallway bathroom and detailed the fraudulent emergency medical guardianship petition. Gaines announced to the completely silent room that Javan had intentionally filed fabricated medical claims to forcibly institutionalize his parents. He pulled the notarized psychiatric certificates from his breast pocket, the exact documents Brenda and I had secured just hours ago. He displayed the pristine cognitive clearances signed by 3 board-certified neurologists. Gaines stated clearly that attempting to kidnap completely sane, legally competent individuals for financial gain crossed the threshold into a multitude of felony jurisdictions. Javan stared at the flawless medical evaluations, his mind finally comprehending the sheer magnitude of my counterattack. I had not merely anticipated his ambush, I had legally weaponized it against him. The meticulous paper trail he thought would save him was now the exact evidence required to secure his federal indictment. Nadine stepped forward from the shadows of the archway. Her face was chalk white, but she forced a desperate, trembling smile, attempting to salvage her parents' parasitic future. She raised her hands in a placating gesture, claiming this was all a terrible misunderstanding. She addressed the police officers directly, using her most polished high society tone. She insisted that the forged deed and the medical petition were simply the result of a private family dispute over estate management. She argued that no crime had been committed, that the police presence was entirely unnecessary, and that this aggressive misunderstanding could be resolved quietly behind closed doors. She was trying to protect the offshore accounts she had been secretly feeding with Javan's stolen business credit. She knew a federal investigation would instantly freeze the stolen money she had funneled to Gregory and Cynthia. Attorney Gaines turned his head slowly, fixing Nadine with a stare that stripped away every layer of her manufactured elegance. He cut off her frantic explanation with brutal precision. He explained that a family disagreement involves arguments over holiday dinners. Forging official municipal records and attempting to physically remove property owners under false medical pretenses instantly elevates a domestic dispute into a federal felony. Gaines revealed that his forensic team had already tracked the massive unauthorized wire transfers Nadine had orchestrated from Javan's failing firm. He detailed how those funds were routed through offshore shell companies directly into Gregory and Cynthia's failing accounts to cover their luxury car leases and country club dues. I had spent 30 years acquiring commercial real estate, mastering the intricate, invisible mechanics of corporate shielding. I knew exactly how to track stolen capital. Nadine gasped, taking a sharp step backward as the full exposure of her own betrayal was laid bare in front of her husband and the police. Absolute panic seized Javon. He looked from Nadine's terrified, guilty face to the unforgiving expressions of the police officers. His entire world was disintegrating in real time. The wife who was supposed to elevate his status had been actively draining his last remaining resources. The father he believed was a simple, uneducated laborer had orchestrated a flawless legal checkmate. Javon slammed his fist onto the dining table, rattling the crystal glasses. He waved the forged property deed wildly at the silent investors and the armed officers. He shouted hoarsely that the house was legally his birthright. He screamed that his father's name was on the original municipal title, and as the sole heir, he possessed the absolute legal authority to sign proxy transfers in a financial emergency. He insisted the sale must go through, claiming the paperwork in his hand proved his ultimate ownership of the estate, regardless of the medical petitions. He was clinging to the very last fragment of his crumbling empire, demanding that reality bend to his desperate fiction. Attorney Gaines watched Javon unravel with a cold, predatory smile. He did not interrupt the frantic screaming. He simply waited for Javon to exhaust his lungs. When the room finally fell quiet again, Gaines adjusted his briefcase. He announced with absolute lethal clarity that the forged deed Javon was clutching was legally useless garbage. Gaines instructed my son to look much closer at the county tax records he had so arrogantly skimmed. He revealed that Lamar had never held this property in his personal name. The estate did not belong to a vulnerable old man. It belonged entirely to a heavily guarded corporate entity called Caldwell Equity. And Javon had just attempted to defraud a multi-million-dollar corporation. Attorney Marcus Gaines withdrew a stack of crisp watermarked documents from his leather briefcase and let them fan out across the polished mahogany table. He did not look at my son with anger, but rather with the clinical fascination of a scientist examining a thoroughly defeated specimen. Gaines explained to the silent room that the estate we were standing in was not a private residence subject to standard inheritance laws or probate court. It was a primary asset held by Caldwell Equity, a heavily fortified, multi-tiered corporate trust. Javon had not simply forged a signature to bypass an eviction. He had attempted to execute the unauthorized liquidation of a massive corporate holding. Gaines pointed a sharp finger at the fraudulent deed still trembling in Javon's hand, dissecting the legal reality with surgical precision. He stated that because I was the sole proprietor, the primary shareholder, and the acting chief executive officer of Caldwell Equity, any attempt to transfer this property without my explicit notarized corporate authorization constituted a federal offense. The magnitude of the crime had instantly shifted from a domestic dispute into a high-level corporate fraud investigation. Javon was no longer a greedy son trying to steal his father's house. In the eyes of the law, he was a criminal actor attempting to defraud a multi-million-dollar corporation. Gaines turned to the two uniformed police officers standing guard in the foyer, confirming that the intensive care unit medical records Javon had fabricated to support his guardianship petition would serve as the foundational evidence for the federal indictment. Javon's entire strategy of using my supposed mental decline to steal the house was now the exact weapon the authorities would use to bury him in a federal penitentiary. The 5 wealthy real estate investors who had been quietly sipping wine and anticipating a lucrative property acquisition suddenly understood the catastrophic legal peril they were standing in. They were not purchasing a distressed asset from a motivated seller. They were being actively recruited to purchase stolen corporate property. The realization hit them like a physical blow. A man in a tailored silver suit at the far end of the table abruptly slammed his crystal glass down the dark red wine splashing across the pristine white tablecloth. He glared at Javon with absolute unrestrained revulsion. He recognized that participating in this transaction would have implicated his own investment firm in a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy. The investors did not ask for clarification or offer any polite excuses. They grabbed their expensive overcoats and moved swiftly toward the front door, treating Javon as if he carried a highly contagious disease. Javon lunged forward, his voice cracking in a desperate, pathetic plea. He begged them to stay, frantically waving the worthless piece of paper in his hand, promising them extreme discounts and immediate returns. The men ignored him completely, stepping around the flooded marble of the hallway and walking out into the cold night air without a single backward glance. The heavy front doors clicked shut behind them, sealing my son's fate. His final lifeline had just driven away. Attorney Gaines looked at Javon and delivered the ultimate death blow to his illusion of control. He stated that since the property belonged to Caldwell Equity, Javon held absolutely no residential rights. He was not a tenant. He was not a family member residing in a shared home. Legally, he was an unauthorized squatter occupying a commercial asset. Gaines turned to the police officers and officially requested that the trespassers be removed from the corporate premises. I stepped forward, moving out from beneath the glare of the chandelier, and looked directly into my son's terrified eyes. The bespoke charcoal suit I wore felt like armor, a physical manifestation of the reality I had carefully hidden from him for decades. I told him that he had spent his entire life running away from the scent of hard work, terrified that the world would view him as ordinary. He had mistaken my worn transit uniform and my calloused hands for a lack of ambition. I explained that 30 years ago, while he was crying for expensive toys, I was purchasing a single dilapidated storefront on the edge of the industrial district. I bought it with the overtime money I earned standing in the freezing rain at the municipal yard. I rebuilt that crumbling structure with my own hands, leased it, and used the profits to buy the next building and then the next. I built a silent, sprawling empire while he was busy renting sports cars and buying imported watches to impress people who did not care if he lived or died. I intentionally maintained the facade of a simple, exhausted laborer because I desperately wanted him to learn the discipline of building a foundation. I wanted him to understand that true wealth is constructed in absolute silence, forged through patience and grueling sacrifice. Instead, he had chosen the path of a parasite. He had tried to build his imaginary kingdom by cannibalizing the very foundation I had laid down for him. I told him that a man who demands the crown without ever lifting a stone will always be crushed by the weight of his own arrogance. His desperate need to appear wealthy had completely bankrupted his soul. The devastation in this room was absolute, but the silent adjustment I had orchestrated was not yet complete. The heavy machinery of my retaliation had crushed Javon's fraudulent empire, but the secondary betrayal operating in the shadows still required immediate, decisive execution. I turned my attention away from my broken son and fixed my gaze directly on Nadine. She was pressing herself against the far wall of the dining room, her breathing shallow and erratic. She had watched Javon's destruction with a mixture of horror and selfish relief, silently calculating that she could simply detach herself from his ruin and walk away clean. She believed her secret financial maneuvers were completely insulated from the blast radius. I walked slowly around the edge of the mahogany table, stopping just a few feet away from her. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the second plastic sleeve containing the reconstructed strips of paper from the basement garbage. I held up the meticulously taped-together ledger detailing her massive, unauthorized offshore wire transfers. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute certainty in my tone made her flinch. I told her that parasites rarely realize when the host has died until they begin to starve. I revealed that my corporate forensic team had already tracked every single dollar she had secretly siphoned from Javon's failing business lines. I detailed the exact routing numbers of the shell accounts she had established to funnel stolen capital to her bankrupt parents. Gregory and Cynthia, standing frozen in the archway, suddenly let out synchronized gasps of pure terror as I named the specific holding companies they were using to pay their country club dues. I smiled coldly at Nadine, informing her that forging commercial loan transfers to fund a lavish lifestyle was a highly prosecutable offense. I explained that I held the definitive proof of her embezzlement, and I was holding the keys to her immediate survival or her absolute legal ruin. The trap had expanded, pulling her and her arrogant parents directly into the center of the crosshairs. Nadine's breath hitched in her throat as the reality of her exposure settled over her. She had spent years cultivating an image of independent entrepreneurial success, carefully separating her high-end lifestyle from the failing mechanics of my son's consulting firm. I watched her eyes dart toward the foyer, searching for an escape route that no longer existed. I stepped closer, deliberately invading her carefully guarded personal space, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. I asked her if she recalled the day she signed the commercial lease for her luxury boutique in the city's most exclusive downtown retail district. She had thrown a lavish opening party, drinking imported champagne, and boasting to her socialite friends about securing prime real estate from a notoriously strict management conglomerate. I reached into the leather folder resting in my hand and extracted a single crisp commercial lease agreement. I held it up under the warm glow of the chandelier so she could clearly read the corporate header. I explained that the faceless management conglomerate she sent her exorbitant monthly rent checks to was nothing more than a subsidiary shell company. It was a minor holding fully owned, operated, and heavily monitored by Caldwell Equity. The blood rushed completely from her face, leaving her pristine makeup looking like a tragic, cracked mask. The exclusive high society boutique she used to validate her superiority over my wife and me was entirely my property. I owned the expansive display windows, the polished marble floors, and the heavy glass doors she unlocked every single morning. Her entire entrepreneurial identity existed strictly because I allowed it to exist, and she had just bitten the hand that owned the ground she stood on. I turned my back on Nadine's silent, trembling form and shifted my focus back to my son. Javon was leaning heavily against the edge of the dining table, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. He had watched me systematically dismantle his wife's financial independence, completely powerless to stop the destruction of their shared illusion. I walked directly up to him, stopping only when the tips of my polished shoes nearly touched the scuffed leather of his own. I reminded him of the towering 20-story glass skyscraper downtown, where he rented the sprawling corner office for his consulting firm. He had routinely mocked my scuffed work boots and faded jackets, while bragging loudly at family dinners about the panoramic city views his exorbitant commercial lease provided. I reached back into my folder and pulled out 2 thick, heavy manila envelopes bearing the aggressive red stamp of a federal commercial litigator. I slapped the first envelope hard against Javon's chest, forcing him to catch it, then tossed the second onto the flooded table in front of Nadine. I announced with absolute lethal clarity that they were both holding immediate commercial eviction notices. I cited the specific ironclad clauses within their leases that mandated instant termination in the event of criminal breach of contract, severe financial fraud, and active embezzlement conducted on corporate premises. I informed them that my private security contractors were already standing in the lobbies of both their buildings. The commercial locks had been electronically changed 10 minutes ago. Their keycards were permanently deactivated. All physical assets, inventory, client servers, and office equipment currently inside those properties had been legally seized to cover the massive debts and stolen funds they had generated. Their professional lives were entirely and irrevocably liquidated. A low, strangled sound escaped Javon's throat. His eyes widened in absolute agonizing comprehension as the cascading reality of the past 5 years finally crashed down upon him. He stammered, his voice breaking, as he verbally pieced the truth together in front of the silent, flooded room. He realized that for half a decade, every single extortionate rent check he had written to maintain his prestigious corporate address had been routed directly into my corporate accounts. He had been literally financing the expansion of my empire while actively mocking the very foundation it was built upon. He had spent years lecturing me on the sophisticated mechanics of modern wealth generation, entirely unaware that he was simply a minor, unprofitable tenant in my kingdom. He had purchased expensive tailored suits, leased foreign luxury cars, and hosted lavish dinners to project an aura of immense success, while I quietly collected his massive monthly payments, wearing a faded municipal transit jacket. The profound, inescapable humiliation of his immense arrogance completely broke him. He had never been the master of his own universe. He had always been a deeply flawed, easily manipulated pawn, operating entirely within the boundaries of my silent, invisible control. True wealth does not require applause. It requires patience, and my patience had just run out. The sheer totality of the destruction hung heavily in the damp air of the dining room. Javon and Nadine were completely paralyzed, stripped of their money, their businesses, and their fraudulent social standing in a matter of minutes. But the parasitic infection within my home had not yet been fully eradicated. Gregory and Cynthia, having witnessed the absolute annihilation of their daughter and son-in-law, suddenly realized their own luxurious free ride was rapidly terminating. Fear rapidly mutated into indignant, desperate rage. Gregory pushed himself away from the living room wall, puffing out his chest in a pathetic, transparent display of false bravado. Cynthia flanked him immediately, crossing her arms and lifting her chin in a mask of aggressive, entitled defiance. Gregory stepped forward, his voice loud and artificially commanding, desperately trying to reclaim control of a sinking ship. He declared that regardless of corporate ownership, federal fraud charges, or commercial evictions, they were not leaving this house. He announced that he and his wife had resided in the master suite long enough to establish ironclad tenant rights under state residential law. Cynthia shrieked her agreement, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. She threatened to hire aggressive housing advocates and tie Caldwell Equity up in residential court for years. They adamantly refused to pack their belongings, daring me to physically drag them out of the house. They believed the sluggish, bureaucratic nature of residential eviction laws would provide them an impenetrable legal shield against my immediate wrath. The echoes of Cynthia's shrill threat faded into the damp air of the grand dining room, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. Gregory and Cynthia stood shoulder to shoulder in the archway, their chins tilted upward in a desperate display of aristocratic defiance. They genuinely believed they had found a legal loophole, a bureaucratic shield, that would protect them from the immediate consequences of their parasitic existence. They assumed my wealth was purely residential, limited to the walls surrounding us, and that the sluggish machinery of local housing courts would allow them to comfortably bleed my estate dry for another 2 years. I looked at Gregory's flushed face and Cynthia's trembling manicured finger with absolute unvarnished disdain. They were attempting to wield tenant rights against the very man who had just dismantled their daughter's commercial empire in less than 60 seconds. I did not argue with their assessment of local residential law. I did not dispute the notoriously slow process of municipal eviction proceedings. Instead, I slowly turned my head toward Attorney Gaines. The seasoned litigator stood perfectly still, a cold, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Without requiring a single spoken command, he unsnapped the brass locks of his briefcase for the second time. He reached deep into the leather compartment and extracted a thick, secondary legal folder, bound with heavy-duty commercial clips. The folder was dense, heavy with the weight of meticulously gathered financial intelligence. He handed it to me with a sharp, definitive nod. I held the heavy file in my left hand, letting the weight of their impending destruction rest in my palm. The defiant smirks on Gregory and Cynthia's faces began to fracture, replaced by the initial creeping shadows of uncertainty. They watched the transfer of the legal documents with growing dread, suddenly realizing that a man who owns a corporate fortress does not rely on local housing court to handle a domestic pest infestation. I broke the seal on the heavy folder and let the thick stack of corporate banking records slide onto the polished surface of the dining table. I looked directly at Gregory and asked him if he truly believed his secret financial hemorrhaging was invisible to the open market. I detailed the exact catastrophic state of his supposedly prestigious country club. I cited the plummeting membership numbers, the millions of dollars in deferred maintenance, and the predatory mezzanine loans he had desperately secured to keep the club's doors open. Gregory's face lost all color, draining to a sickening, chalky white. I explained that private equity lenders are completely devoid of loyalty. When a debtor begins to drown, those lenders immediately look to offload the distressed debt to the highest bidder to mitigate their own losses. I picked up the top document, a heavily redacted transfer of commercial debt, and turned it so Gregory could clearly see the corporate seals. I informed him that exactly 48 hours ago, Caldwell Equity had swept in and purchased the entirety of his country club's distressed debt at a massive premium. I was no longer just the man whose house he was illegally occupying. I was officially the primary secured creditor of his entire financial existence. I owned the mortgage on his golf course, the liens on his clubhouses, and the personal guarantees he had foolishly signed against his own remaining assets. Cynthia let out a sharp, breathless gasp, clutching her husband's arm for physical support as her legs threatened to give out. I slid a formal notarized foreclosure notice across the table. I announced that due to his consecutive defaults over the past 3 quarters, I was exercising my contractual right to initiate immediate corporate foreclosure proceedings right here in the foyer. The country club was gone. Their primary source of income, their social standing, and their last remaining shred of leverage were completely liquidated with a single stroke of my pen. The absolute totality of his ruin washed over Gregory in a visible wave of physical sickness. His arrogant posture collapsed entirely, his broad shoulders sagging as if the bones had been removed from his spine. He stared at the foreclosure notice resting on the damp wood, his mind flashing back to his behavior over the past 6 months. He had strutted through my home as an entitled conqueror. He had left his dirty, grass-stained golf clothes piled carelessly on the laundry room floor, explicitly instructing me to wash and fold them while he lounged on my back patio drinking imported scotch. He had treated the founder of a multi-million-dollar corporate empire like a hired domestic servant, completely blinded by his own narcissistic assumptions regarding class and labor. He had sneered at my calloused hands, assuming my quiet demeanor was born of subservience rather than disciplined calculation. Now standing paralyzed in the harsh light of the dining room, the horrifying reality of his misjudgment crushed him. The man he had treated as a personal maid was the exact architect of his financial execution. The artificial high society existence he had clung to was completely dismantled by the very hands he had mocked. The condescending superiority in his eyes melted away, replaced by the wide, empty stare of absolute suffocating terror. Gregory opened his mouth, attempting to formulate a plea for mercy, but no sound materialized. The room remained perfectly still, the silence broken only by the sharp, authoritative voice of Attorney Gaines. Gaines stepped past me, his leather shoes splashing slightly in the pooled water near the hallway. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a single brightly colored legal document bearing the raised seal of a federal magistrate. He did not address the foreclosure or the commercial debt. He focused entirely on the immediate physical reality of the room. Gaines announced that claiming tenant rights was a residential matter, but organizing an orchestrated medical kidnapping was a criminal one. He held the document aloft, declaring it an emergency magistrate-approved removal order. The order was granted explicitly on the grounds that Javon Nadine Gregory and Cynthia presented an active documented physical threat to the legal property owner. The fraudulent psychiatric committal forms Javon had signed mere minutes ago provided the absolute legal justification for their immediate expulsion. Gaines turned slowly toward the 2 uniformed police officers standing silently in the foyer. He gave them a sharp, definitive nod. The officers stepped forward in perfect synchronization. Their hands dropped simultaneously to rest heavily on the grips of their duty belts, the leather creaking loudly in the quiet room. The lead officer looked directly at Gregory and Javon. His expression hardened and completely devoid of patience. He instructed every unauthorized individual in the room to step outside onto the front lawn, immediately warning them that any failure to comply would result in instant physical arrest. The trap had closed, the locks were sealed, and the final extraction was about to begin. The 2 uniformed police officers stood with their hands resting on their utility belts, their presence forming an impassable physical barrier between Javon and any hope of salvation. The 5 sharp-eyed real estate investors the men Javan had desperately courted to fund his failing empire did not need to hear another word. The sheer toxicity of the room, thick with federal fraud allegations and impending arrests, acted as an absolute repellent. The lead investor, a man who had spent the entire evening sipping imported wine and discussing property valuations, slammed his crystal glass down onto the mahogany table. The sharp crack of the glass against the wood echoed like a gunshot. He stared at Javan with unmasked contempt. He stated loudly that he had been in the business of distressed assets for 30 years, but he had never witnessed a man attempt to sell stolen corporate property while orchestrating the kidnapping of the actual chief executive officer. The investor signaled his colleagues, and the group immediately abandoned the dining room. They moved with frantic urgency, stepping over the puddles of water, soaking the Persian rugs, desperate to distance themselves from a federal crime scene. Javan lunged toward them, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched plea. He begged them to wait, promising absurd discounts and immediate returns on investment, waving his empty hands in the air. The investors completely ignored him. They pushed past the silent caterers, threw open the heavy front doors, and marched out into the night. The harsh thud of the oak doors closing behind them sounded like the final nail being driven into Javan's coffin. His absolute last chance at securing capital, his final lifeline to pacify the private equity lenders. Breathing down his neck had just driven away in a fleet of luxury sedans. The sophisticated illusion of immense wealth he had meticulously constructed over the past 5 years shattered completely, leaving him standing in a flooded hallway with nothing but a worthless forged piece of paper and a rapidly impending federal indictment. As the reality of total financial annihilation settled over the foyer, Nadine's survival instinct violently reasserted itself. The meticulously crafted mask of the supportive high society wife evaporated instantly. She looked at Javan not with sympathy or shared panic, but with pure, unadulterated venom. Her luxury boutique was gone. Her offshore accounts were frozen. Her parents were facing immediate commercial foreclosure. Every single parasitic avenue she had exploited was now sealed by my corporate litigators. She marched directly up to Javan, her manicured hands curled into tight, trembling fists. She did not lower her voice to preserve any sense of dignity. She screamed at him, her words echoing harshly off the marble floors. She called him a pathetic, hollow shell of a man, an absolute failure who could not even manage to successfully steal from his own parents. Javan recoiled, lifting his hands in a weak attempt to calm her, but his placating gestures only fueled her rage. Nadine leaned in close, ensuring every person in the room heard the absolute truth of their union. She explicitly stated that she had never loved him. She declared that she had only tolerated his insufferable arrogance and leased lifestyle because she believed he was the sole heir to a massive liquid fortune. She had married an anticipated inheritance, not a husband. She admitted without a single ounce of shame that she had spent the last 5 years waiting for his parents to die or become incapacitated so she could finally claim the estate she felt she deserved. Javan stood completely paralyzed, the verbal blows striking him harder than the legal documents resting on his chest. His entire identity was tied to her validation. He had alienated his family-forged documents and risked federal prison entirely to maintain the lifestyle she demanded. Hearing his wife publicly reduce their marriage to a failed commercial transaction stripped away his last remaining shred of humanity. He was left entirely hollow, staring at the woman who had just cut his throat to save herself. The vicious echo of Nadine's confession hung in the air, a stark display of transactional greed. Then a quiet, steady voice broke through the tension. Brenda stepped forward from the shadows of the corridor, moving past me to stand fully in the light of the chandelier. She had remained entirely silent throughout the evening, watching her son orchestrate her committal and witnessing her daughter-in-law unleash her venom. She wrapped her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, her posture straight and unbroken. She looked directly into Nadine's calculating eyes. Brenda spoke with a calm, devastating authority. She stated that a marriage built entirely on bank accounts and leveraged credit will always crumble the exact second the vault is locked shut. She recounted the early days of our own marriage, decades before Caldwell Equity existed. She spoke of the years we spent living in a cramped, drafty apartment, sharing single meals and counting loose change to keep the electricity running. She explained that true partnerships are forged in the fires of shared hardship and mutual sacrifice, not purchased with stolen corporate funds and designer labels. We had built our empire together side by side, knowing that if we lost every single dollar tomorrow, our foundation would remain entirely intact. Brenda turned her gaze to Javon, her eyes reflecting profound sorrow and absolute finality. She told him that he had traded a family that would have died for him, for a woman who would not even stand by him when the money ran dry. Nadine did not offer a single word of rebuttal to Brenda's quiet condemnation. She possessed no defense against the truth. She spun around on her expensive heels, ignoring Javon entirely, and locked eyes with her terrified parents. Gregory and Cynthia were still trembling near the archway, the reality of their foreclosed country club and impending eviction fully paralyzing their cognitive functions. Nadine snapped at them, her voice sharp and devoid of any familial warmth. She ordered them to move immediately, demanding they go upstairs and pack only what they could physically carry to their leased vehicles. She explicitly stated that the police officers were standing right there with an active removal order, and she refused to be dragged out of the house in handcuffs over her husband's catastrophic legal failures. Gregory and Cynthia did not hesitate. They scurried past the armed officers, their heads bowed in profound humiliation, rushing up the grand staircase to salvage whatever designer clothing they could grab. Nadine walked briskly to the hall closet, retrieving her imported trench coat and a leather overnight bag. She did not look back at Javon. She did not offer a farewell or a promise of future contact. She simply stepped around the puddles of water in the foyer, walked out the front door, and disappeared into the darkness. Javon stood completely frozen in the center of the grand entryway. The catering staff had fled. The investors were gone. The psychiatric orderlies had retreated. His wife and in-laws were actively abandoning him. He remained motionless under the bright crystal lights, a man who had sacrificed his entire soul to build a kingdom of lies, now forced to watch his fabricated life evaporate into absolute nothingness. The echoing click of the front door shutting behind the wealthy investors acted as the final devastating blow that severed the strings holding Javon upright. His legs gave out entirely, completely unable to support the weight of his collapsing reality. He crashed onto the damp, water-stained hardwood floor of the foyer, his expensive tailored tuxedo trousers soaking up the muddy, flooded residue left behind by the departed paramedics. He did not attempt to stand or preserve any shred of his previously unshakable dignity. Instead, he scrambled forward on his knees, his hands reaching out frantically to grasp the perfectly pressed hem of my charcoal trousers. He looked up at me, his face slick with a pathetic mixture of nervous sweat and terrified tears. The sophisticated corporate vocabulary he utilized to manipulate boardrooms and intimidate rivals vanished instantly, replaced by the desperate, unstructured pleading of a cornered child. He began to beg for mercy, his voice cracking and echoing shrilly against the high vaulted ceiling of the grand entryway. He invoked the word family over and over again, wielding the term like a desperate magical incantation that he believed could instantly erase the massive federal fraud he had just committed. He pleaded for a second chance, swearing profusely that he had only acted out of intense, unbearable financial pressure, claiming that the predatory private equity lenders were threatening to completely destroy his life. He sobbed openly, demanding that I authorize an emergency corporate bailout from Caldwell Equity to satisfy his aggressive creditors and make the impending federal wire fraud charges disappear. He claimed that sending him to a federal penitentiary would permanently stain our family legacy and ruin his future. He wept, declaring that he was still our flesh and blood, completely blind to the fact that he was demanding salvation from the exact people he had meticulously planned to destroy. I did not step away from his grasping, trembling hands. I stood perfectly still, looking down at him, forcing him to feel the absolute immovable stone of my resolve. I turned my gaze away from his weeping face and looked directly at Brenda. She stood quietly near the archway, wrapped tightly in her woolen shawl, her expression composed and entirely unreadable. Looking at her quiet strength, a profound, visceral memory eclipsed the chaotic noise of my son's pathetic begging. I remembered a bitterly cold night decades ago, during the very first winter of our marriage. The archaic heating unit in our dilapidated one-room apartment had failed entirely. I remembered walking home from a grueling double shift at the transit yard, my muscles burning with exhaustion, to find Brenda standing in the freezing, torrential rain near the bus stop. She was clutching a single worn canvas duffel bag containing our only warm clothes, waiting patiently in the biting cold so we could walk to a municipal emergency shelter together. We had possessed absolutely nothing but our shared determination to survive the night. We had built an impenetrable corporate fortress out of that specific shared suffering. I looked back down at the weeping, broken man kneeling in the puddle of foyer water. He had never known the agonizing bite of that freezing rain. He had only known the immense warmth of the fire we had built to keep him safe, and he had arrogantly tried to burn our entire house down with it. I leaned forward, ensuring my voice was kept dangerously low, entirely devoid of any residual anger or paternal affection. I spoke with the cold, clinical precision of a corporate liquidator finalizing a bankruptcy. I told him that I was executing a permanent restructuring of my assets. I recited the exact calculated words he had used against us when he believed he held all the power. I stated firmly that he simply did not fit the aesthetic of my future. The words struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. His frantic sobbing choked off into a sharp, ragged gasp. He stared up at me, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that my verdict was absolute and non-negotiable. He stammered weakly, claiming that I was supposed to be a man of faith, a father who fundamentally believed in the absolute power of forgiveness. I adjusted my silk cuffs, staring down at him with unblinking, icy certainty. I explained that forgiveness is a quiet, internal grace given freely to cleanse one's own soul of toxic resentment. But trust is a hard, uncompromising currency that must be painstakingly earned and meticulously maintained. I told him I forgave him for his profound stupidity and his blinding arrogance, but I would never trust him with another fraction of a second of my life. Trust requires a bedrock foundation of honor, and he had completely burned his trust to ashes the very moment he prioritized his own insatiable greed over his mother's physical and mental safety. He had willfully invited heavily armed tactical orderlies into this home to drag the woman who gave him life into a locked psychiatric ward simply to balance his failing corporate ledger. I explained that blood merely dictates biology, but loyalty dictates family. He had voluntarily surrendered his position as my son the second he signed that fraudulent medical committal form. Attorney Gaines checked his silver wristwatch with a sharp, dismissive flick of his wrist. He turned his attention to the two uniformed police officers standing silently by the doorway, nodding sharply to indicate that the legal parameters of the emergency removal order were now fully active. The lead officer stepped forward, his heavy tactical boots echoing loudly against the damp floorboards, cutting off any further debate. He looked down at Javon, then raised his voice, projecting it clearly up the grand staircase where Nadine and her parents were frozen in shock. The officer announced with absolute uncompromising authority that every unauthorized individual had exactly 10 minutes to pack a single bag of personal belongings and vacate the premises. He explicitly warned that any items left behind would be permanently impounded by corporate security and liquidated to cover outstanding civil damages. A chaotic, humiliating panic instantly erupted throughout the estate. The heavy thud of desperate footsteps pounded against the ceiling as Gregory, Cynthia, and Nadine scrambled wildly through the upstairs corridors. They ripped expensive designer clothing from velvet hangers, shoving garments haphazardly into canvas bags, weeping and screaming accusations at each other as their aristocratic facade completely shattered. Javon dragged himself off the wet floor, stumbling blindly toward the stairs, frantically trying to salvage whatever remnants of his high society wardrobe he could physically carry. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Brenda in the quiet foyer, watching them tear their lives apart in a blind frenzy. The predators were experiencing the exact terrifying trauma of sudden forced extraction they had so callously orchestrated for my wife. The 10 minutes expired rapidly, and Javon descended the stairs one final time, completely alone in the center of the foyer, watching his fabricated life evaporate into nothingness. The heavy, frantic thud of footsteps finally ceased, replaced by the grating sound of zippers and dragging canvas. Having been given no choice but to surrender to the absolute legal ruin I had meticulously laid out before them, Javon, Nadine, Gregory, and Cynthia descended the grand sweeping staircase for the final time. They looked nothing like the aristocratic conquerors who had occupied my home for the past 6 months. They were a disheveled, panting mess of ruined vanity. Gregory struggled under the weight of a straining leather duffel bag, his face flushed and covered in a sheen of nervous perspiration. Cynthia followed closely behind him, clutching a velvet garment bag to her chest, as if it were a life preserver. Javon moved like a hollow vessel, his eyes fixed firmly on the flooded marble floor, completely unable to meet my gaze or look at his mother. Nadine, however, refused to surrender her illusion of superiority. She reached the bottom step and immediately squared her shoulders violently, adjusting the collar of her imported trench coat. She pulled her sleek smartphone from her pocket, her thumbs flying across the glass screen with desperate aggression. She loudly announced to her parents that they would not suffer the indignity of standing on the street like common vagrants. She declared she was booking the penthouse suite at the Grand Imperial Hotel downtown, securing a luxury refuge where they could escape the impending rain and coordinate their legal retaliation. She held her chin high, attempting to pierce through the heavy silence of the foyer with a display of financial invulnerability. She demanded that Javon pick up her bag, fully expecting her elite status to instantly shield her from the brutal reality of the eviction. The triumphant chime of a confirmed reservation never materialized. Instead, the bright screen of Nadine's phone flashed with a harsh, glaring red decline notice. She frowned, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together in a mix of confusion and mounting irritation. She aggressively tapped the screen to run the transaction through a secondary platinum credit card, muttering about bank errors and automated security glitches. The screen instantly flashed red a second time. A cold, creeping dread began to replace her arrogant posture. She demanded that Javon hand over his corporate black card, snatching his wallet from his trembling hands before he could even register the request. She inputted his account numbers with frantic, shaking fingers, holding her breath as the loading circle spun. The screen flashed red for the third consecutive time. The word "declined" glared back at them, illuminating their absolute ruin. Attorney Marcus Gaines stepped forward, clearing his throat to capture their panicked attention. He adjusted his glasses and explained the brutal, uncompromising reality of modern financial security protocols. He stated that the instant I provided the definitive proof of Nadine's unauthorized offshore wire transfers and Javon's forged commercial loan documents, his firm had initiated a direct automated fraud alert with the Federal Banking Commission. The sheer magnitude of the embezzlement, combined with the active federal investigation into their corporate holdings, had triggered a catastrophic financial freeze. Gaines informed them with clinical precision that every single line of credit checking account, savings portfolio, and investment fund linked to their Social Security numbers had been instantly and permanently frozen, pending a thorough federal audit. They possessed absolutely zero purchasing power. Nadine's hands began to shake uncontrollably as the phone slipped from her grip and clattered onto the marble floor. They could not book a luxury penthouse suite. They could not hail a private town car. They could not even afford a deeply discounted roadside motel for a single night. Their entire financial ecosystem had been completely eradicated, leaving them absolutely penniless in the center of the foyer. The crushing weight of immediate absolute poverty struck Javon with terrifying force. He dropped his canvas bag, his shoulders completely caving inward as he looked at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. His voice broke into a high, pathetic register as he asked me how he was supposed to survive. He pleaded, asking how a man with no money, no home, and frozen accounts was supposed to eat live or function in the real world. I walked slowly toward him, my expression entirely devoid of pity. I reached into the inner pocket of my bespoke suit jacket and withdrew a neatly folded standard paper application for the Municipal Transit Authority. I held it out to him, forcing him to take the cheap, coarse paper in his trembling hands. I told him that he was holding the exact key to his survival. I explained that 30 years ago I took that exact same job wearing a uniform he had spent his entire adult life mocking. I woke up long before dawn gripping the icy steering wheel of a city bus, sacrificing my own comfort to ensure he never went hungry. I instructed him to learn the profound grinding value of a grueling, honest day of physical labor. I stated that forgiveness is a quiet grace given freely, but trust is a hard currency that must be painstakingly earned. He had burned my trust to ash the exact moment he prioritized his own parasitic greed over his mother's safety. He had chosen the path of a predator, and now he would learn exactly how the prey survives on the absolute bottom rung of the city. The lead police officer stepped between us, placing a firm, unyielding hand on Javon's shoulder. The officer announced that their allotted time had expired, gesturing sharply toward the heavy oak front doors. There was no room left for negotiation, no space for another desperate plea or arrogant threat. Gregory and Cynthia moved first, keeping their heads ducked low to avoid making eye contact with anyone in the room. They dragged their heavy bags toward the exit, like defeated prisoners of war entirely stripped of the upper-class vanity they had paraded around my home. Nadine followed closely behind them, her posture completely broken, stepping out into the cold night, without her luxury town car or her penthouse reservation. Javon was the absolute last to leave. He clutched the municipal transit application tightly in his fist, taking one final lingering look at the sprawling, magnificent empire he had foolishly tried to steal. The police officer guided him firmly over the threshold, ensuring he cleared the property line. I stepped forward and grabbed the solid brass handles of the massive double doors, pulling them shut, with a heavy, definitive click that echoed powerfully through the empty foyer. I stood next to Brenda, wrapping my arm around her shoulder, as we watched them through the tall glass sidelights. The four of them stood huddled together on the dark paved driveway, completely exposed to the elements. Above them, the night sky violently opened up. A heavy freezing rain began to fall in thick, unrelenting sheets, soaking through their expensive designer coats and ruining their leather luggage. They shivered violently in the darkness, bringing the narrative entirely full circle. They were now standing in the exact same freezing rain Brenda and I had survived decades ago, but they lacked the love, the resilience, and the foundation required to weather the storm. The freezing rain lashed against the paved driveway, turning the manicured landscape into a harsh, unforgiving wasteland. I stood securely behind, in the thick glass of the sidelights, watching the four figures huddled together in a pathetic attempt to conserve body heat. Javon, Nadine, Gregory, and Cynthia were completely stripped of the arrogant armor they had worn for the past 6 months. Their expensive Italian leather shoes sank into the pooling water and mud near the edge of the property line. The heavy designer coats they had hastily grabbed were rapidly absorbing the icy downpour, clinging to their shivering frames like heavy, suffocating lead. Nadine stood with her ruined overnight bag pressed against her chest, her carefully constructed high society image entirely washed away by the storm. She stared down at her deactivated smartphone, desperately tapping the black screen, as if a magical reprieve might suddenly appear. Gregory and Cynthia flanked her, their shoulders hunched against the biting wind. The country club elites who had spent the evening sipping imported wine and boasting about their impenetrable social standing were now reduced to standing on a suburban street corner without a single dollar to their names. They had no shelter, no transportation, and absolutely no allies left to exploit. Javon stood slightly apart from them, the municipal transit application still clutched tightly in his freezing hand. He did not yell or pound his fists against the invisible barrier separating us. The crushing weight of his federal fraud, his commercial eviction, and his absolute moral failure held him rooted to the wet asphalt. He stared back at the warm, inviting light spilling from the windows of my home, finally understanding the profound magnitude of his loss. The kingdom he had so desperately tried to steal had banished him to the cold, dark reality of the streets he had always mocked. The silence of their defeat was absolute, broken only by the relentless heavy rhythm of the falling rain. I stepped away from the glass and opened the heavy oak front doors one final time. The frigid air immediately rushed into the foyer, biting at the edges of my bespoke charcoal suit, but I did not shiver. I stepped out onto the wide stone porch and walked slowly down the long, winding driveway. I did not rush. I did not carry an umbrella to shield myself from the elements. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who had successfully secured the borders of his hard-earned empire. The rain plastered my hair to my forehead, but my focus remained entirely fixed on the massive wrought-iron security gates standing open at the end of the property line. As I approached, the four of them instinctively stepped backward onto the public sidewalk, their eyes wide with a lingering visceral fear of further retaliation. Javon opened his mouth, his lips trembling violently from the cold, perhaps hoping to launch one final desperate plea for a financial bailout. I did not give him the opportunity to speak. I did not shout a single word of condemnation over the roar of the storm. I did not gloat about the utter destruction of their fraudulent commercial lives or the federal indictments awaiting them in the morning. I simply reached out and grasped the thick, cold metal bars of the primary gate. With a firm, steady pull, I swung the heavy iron structure inward. I reached for the secondary gate and pulled it to meet the center latch. The locking mechanism engaged with a sharp, heavy metallic thud that echoed decisively through the freezing night. The thick iron bars formed an absolute impenetrable physical barrier between my world and theirs. I looked directly into Javon's terrified, bloodshot eyes one last time, ensuring he understood the complete finality of the boundary I had just drawn. Then, without a single backward glance, I turned my back on the four of them and walked slowly up the driveway toward the warmth of my home. I crossed the threshold and pushed the heavy oak doors shut, sealing the freezing storm outside. The chaotic energy that had infected the house for the past 6 months was completely eradicated. The expensive caterers had fled long ago, abandoning their serving trays and half-empty crystal glasses in the dining room. The sprawling estate was enveloped in a profound, heavy silence. I shrugged off the damp charcoal suit jacket, letting it drop carelessly onto a foyer chair, shedding the corporate armor I had worn to execute the liquidation. I walked slowly into the quiet kitchen, the familiar hum of the refrigerator grounding me in the present reality. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, listening to the water heat as I meticulously prepared a pot of chamomile tea. I arranged 2 simple ceramic mugs on a small wooden tray, breathing in the soothing floral aroma. The toxic parasitic element that had threatened to consume our lives had been surgically removed. I carried the warm tray into the living room, where Brenda was waiting for me. She sat quietly on the comfortable sofa, bathed in the soft, flickering orange glow of the fireplace. I handed her a mug and sat down beside her, letting the deep, radiating heat of the hearth seep into my damp clothes. We did not need to discuss the federal fraud, the evictions, or the absolute ruin waiting out in the rain. We simply sat together in the quiet warmth, knowing our foundation remained unbreakable. 6 months later, the aggressive winter storms had surrendered to a mild, forgiving spring. I was driving my old, reliable municipal transit pickup truck through a bustling commercial district on the industrial edge of the city. The radio played softly in the background as I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic. I turned the worn steering wheel and pulled into the narrow drive-through lane of a busy, unglamorous fast food restaurant, intending to buy a simple black coffee. As I idled behind a line of waiting cars, I glanced casually through the large, grease-smudged glass window of the dining area. A worker in a cheap, poorly fitting paper uniform was moving methodically among the plastic booths. He held a wet rag in one hand and a spray bottle of industrial cleaner in the other. I put the truck in park and looked closer. It was Javon. The expensive tailored Italian suits and imported luxury watches were completely gone. His hands were covered in harsh, chemical-smelling soap, and his face was drawn tight with physical exhaustion. He was scrubbing down a sticky table, wiping away spilled ketchup and discarded wrappers left behind by indifferent customers. The insufferable, entitled arrogance that had defined his entire adult existence had been completely stripped away by the harsh reality of survival. He moved with the slow, deliberate focus of a man who was finally learning the profound value of hard, grueling, honest work. He did not look up entirely consumed by the physical demands of earning a minimum wage. I did not tap on the glass to draw his attention. I did not lower my window to offer a greeting or a lecture. I simply took my black coffee from the drive-thru, attendant shifted my old truck back into gear, and drove away, my heart completely at peace. The freezing rain fell in relentless heavy sheets, turning the immaculate front lawn into a dark, muddy swamp. I stood on the porch watching the four figures huddled together on the wrong side of the property line. Javon, Nadine, Gregory, and Cynthia were entirely stripped of the arrogant armor they had worn like a second skin for the past 6 months. The bespoke Italian leather shoes they prized so highly were sinking deep into the pooling water and mud that washed over the paved driveway. The heavy designer coats they had hastily grabbed from the closets were rapidly absorbing the icy downpour, clinging to their shivering frames like suffocating weights of lead. Nadine stood with her ruined leather overnight bag pressed tightly against her chest, her carefully constructed high society image entirely washed away by the brutal storm. She stared down at her permanently deactivated smartphone, desperately tapping the black screen, as if a magical financial reprieve might suddenly illuminate the darkness. Gregory and Cynthia flanked her, their shoulders hunched defensively against the biting wind. The country club elites who had spent the evening sipping imported wine and boasting about their impenetrable social standing were now reduced to standing on a suburban street corner without a single dollar to their names. They had no shelter, no transportation, and absolutely no wealthy allies left to exploit. Javon stood slightly apart from them, the municipal transit application still clutched tightly in his freezing, trembling hand. He did not yell or pound his fists against the invisible barrier separating us. The crushing weight of his federal fraud, his commercial eviction, and his absolute moral failure held him completely rooted to the wet asphalt. He stared back at the warm, inviting light spilling from the windows of my home, finally understanding the profound magnitude of his loss. The corporate kingdom he had so desperately tried to steal had banished him to the cold, dark reality of the streets he had always mocked. The silence of their defeat was absolute, broken only by the relentless, heavy rhythm of the falling rain. I stepped off the wide stone porch and walked slowly down the long, winding driveway. I did not rush my steps, nor did I carry an umbrella to shield myself from the elements. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who had successfully secured the borders of his hard-earned empire. The freezing rain plastered my hair to my forehead and soaked through the shoulders of my bespoke charcoal suit. But my focus remained entirely fixed on the massive wrought-iron security gates standing open at the end of the property line. As I approached, the four of them instinctively stepped backward onto the public sidewalk, their eyes wide with a lingering, visceral fear of further corporate retaliation. Javon opened his mouth, his lips trembling violently from the cold, perhaps hoping to launch one final desperate plea for a financial bailout or a fatherly pardon. I did not give him the opportunity to speak. I did not shout a single word of condemnation over the roar of the storm. I did not gloat about the utter destruction of their fraudulent commercial lives or the federal indictments waiting for them in the morning. I simply reached out and grasped the thick, cold metal bars of the primary gate. With a firm, steady pull, I swung the heavy iron structure inward. I reached for the secondary gate and pulled it to meet the center latch. The locking mechanism engaged with a sharp, heavy metallic thud that echoed decisively through the freezing night. The thick iron bars formed an absolute impenetrable physical barrier between my world and theirs. I looked directly into Javon's terrified, bloodshot eyes one last time, ensuring he understood the complete finality of the boundary I had just drawn. Then, without a single backward glance, I turned my back on the four of them and walked slowly up the driveway toward the warmth of my home. I crossed the threshold and pushed the heavy oak doors shut permanently, sealing the freezing storm outside. The chaotic energy that had infected the house for the past 6 months was completely eradicated. The expensive caterers had fled long ago, abandoning their silver serving trays and half-empty crystal glasses in the dining room. The sprawling estate was enveloped in a profound, heavy silence. I shrugged off the damp charcoal suit jacket, letting it drop carelessly onto a foyer chair, shedding the corporate armor I had worn to execute the liquidation. I walked slowly into the quiet kitchen, the familiar hum of the refrigerator, grounding me in the present reality. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, listening to the water heat as I meticulously prepared a pot of chamomile tea. Brenda and I had shared this exact ritual during the earliest days of our marriage, when a warm cup of tea was the only luxury we could afford. I arranged 2 simple ceramic mugs on a small wooden tray, breathing in the soothing floral aroma. The toxic parasitic element that had threatened to consume our lives had been surgically removed. I carried the warm tray into the living room, where Brenda was waiting. She sat quietly on the comfortable sofa, bathed in the soft, flickering orange glow of the fireplace. I handed her a mug and sat down beside her, letting the deep, radiating heat of the hearth seep into my clothes. We did not need to discuss the federal fraud, the evictions, or the absolute ruin waiting out in the rain. We simply sat together in the quiet warmth, knowing our foundation remained unbreakable. 6 months later, the aggressive winter storms had surrendered to a mild, forgiving spring. I was driving my old reliable pickup truck through a bustling commercial district on the industrial edge of the city. The radio played softly in the background as I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic. I turned the worn steering wheel and pulled into the narrow drive-through lane of a busy, unglamorous fast food restaurant, intending to buy a simple black coffee. As I idled behind a line of waiting cars, I glanced casually through the large, grease-smudged glass window of the dining area. A worker in a cheap, poorly fitting paper uniform was moving methodically among the plastic booths. He held a wet rag in one hand and a spray bottle of industrial cleaner in the other. I put the truck in park and looked closer. It was Javon. The expensive tailored Italian suits and imported luxury watches were completely gone. His hands were covered in harsh, chemical-smelling soap, and his face was drawn tight with physical exhaustion. He was scrubbing down a sticky table, wiping away spilled ketchup and discarded wrappers left behind by indifferent customers. The insufferable, entitled arrogance that had defined his entire adult existence had been completely stripped away by the harsh reality of survival. He moved with the slow, deliberate focus of a man who was finally learning the profound value of hard, grueling, honest work. He did not look up entirely consumed by the physical demands of earning a minimum wage. I did not tap on the glass to draw his attention. I did not lower my window to offer a greeting or a lecture. I simply took my black coffee from the drive-thru, attendant shifted my old truck back into gear, and drove away, my heart completely at peace. True wealth is never measured by the brand of your suit or the address of your business, but by the undeniable strength of the foundation you build with your own 2 hands. Greed acts as a blinding poison that destroys loyalty and consumes the soul, turning family into predators. When you demand the rewards of a kingdom without ever lifting a single stone to construct it, you will eventually be crushed by the weight of your own arrogance. Respect must be painstakingly earned through honest sacrifice, because a life built purely on manipulation will always inevitably collapse into absolute nothingness. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know which city you are listening from and what you would have done in Lamar's position.